Let's talk about branding for your podcast. So, if you are trying to have a scalable podcast business, you got to think about branding. Why? Because branding actually goes beyond the show itself. Branding has to do with your merch. Branding has to do with sponsorship, with advertising, with how you engage with your audience in the long term. So that's the scalability part of things. Okay. So let me give you some generalities here before we talk about how to build a brand this year. First of all, why does your podcast need a brand in the first place? The thing is that you have to really differentiate yourself, okay? If you are trying to really, let's say, swim in a very competitive sea that podcasting really is, you got to differentiate yourself. So crafting a distinct brand for your podcast is actually essential to your success in today's very saturated podcast landscape. You're having close to a 3 million podcast on the internet. I mean, this is just on Apple Podcast. If you were to think about the 3 million or the 4 million podcast on Spotify, the whole equation becomes very hard to navigate. Okay, so you have competition from major players. So you got to really understand how you differentiate yourself. So much like investing in creating memorable logos and catchy jingles, your podcast's brand assets are extension of your brand's values and essence. These elements do a lot of things. First of all, they communicate your podcast's strength. Second of all, they also make it more memorable and engaging for your show. Okay, so basically, what happens here is that your podcast branding becomes shorthand for your brain. The whole branding, the tone, and that this facilitates the recognition and resonance among your audience across various platforms, from let's say social media to merchandise. Again, this goes back to what I said about the scalability of your show. You can use a branded podcast as a sales tool. This is how you are going to generate revenue on a consistent basis. So when it comes to a branded podcast, something that we always that I always really encourage on this show, you have to understand that the bottom line here is for you to have a sustainable revenue model. So if you want to really build a brand for your podcast this year, let's go back to the essentials. The first thing you want to do here is to think about the name. The name is going to be very important. The name is going to be the foundation of your podcast brand. Okay, I mean you have 5 to 10 million brands. I mean 5 to 10 million podcasts out there. How do you really differentiate yourself? It's not just colors. It's not just logos. The name also. The name is really important. So your branded podcast name not only captures the essence of your show, but it also does something very, very important. It sparks curiosity, right? It resonates with your audience. It leaves a lasting impression on potential listeners, but also potential sponsors. Because you're having a conversation with listeners, but you're also having the same conversation with sponsors and advertisers too. Because advertisers will come if you are able to have a great relationship with your audience, right? So let me give you a few tips when it comes to naming your show this year. First of all, you want to reflect big time on your podcast purpose. Ask yourself, what am I trying to really reach? What am I trying to really achieve here? What is the purpose of my podcast? So your name should really reflect that. You want to keep it short and memorable. So when it comes to naming your podcast, don't go for let's say a long name. No, you want your audience to remember your podcast, especially if they're searching for it, or especially if they are really referring it to their friends and family, right? So if you have a too long podcast name, you're just really shooting yourself in the foot, really. You want to conduct keyword research to make sure that basically you have relevant keywords that are associated with your podcast niche, because you do not want your name to really be a very, very far away from your podcast niche. You got to really also think about checking for trademark and domain availability, because the whole thing is you do not want to really pick a name for your podcast and realize later on that, hey, listen, that name actually is going to infringe on somebody's intellectual property. So the second thing you want to do when it comes to building a brand for your podcast this year is to think about cover art. I mean, cover art is something quite essential that a lot of podcasters don't really pay attention to. But the cover art is going to differentiate yourself because when people search for a podcast on Spotify or on Apple Podcast or on Amazon or on on Google or even YouTube, they have to really they have to find a display, a thumbnail, if you will, that resonates with them. So your branded podcast cover art is actually a distinctive brand marker that really does a lot of things. First of all, it entices potential listeners. Number two, it distinguishes your podcast in the increasingly competitive audio landscape. Number three, it actually solidifies the attachment your potential listeners have for your podcast. So over time, what happens here is that your cover will be the first thing that listeners will notice. So creating a design that reflects the quality and content of your show is really crucial in leaving a lasting impression. Think about a podcast cover art as similar to a YouTube video thumbnail. Okay, that's important. Now, there are lots of ways to go about designing your podcast cover art. Many solo discussions or interview shows leverage cover art featuring host photos, establishing an immediate connection between the audience and the personalities behind the microphone. And equally, many brands collaborate with an artist to actually design a cover that symbolizes their show's themes and elements in a more abstract way. So you got to really ask yourself how much you are willing to invest in a design in a design job. Okay, so you want to really find the right target audience that will you want to find the target audience, but you want to find the cover art that will resonate with that target audience. Okay, you can actually build your brand, visual identity, and tone of voice, and find the right marketing channels for your product if you're able to have the right cover art, and that's important from a scalability point of view. Next, I want you to think about audio branding. So if you're trying to build a brand this year for your podcast, go a little bit more sonic, a little bit more audio. Okay, so branding is not just visual; it can also be it can also be let's say sonic. Okay, so it's not just about the content; it's about how it sounds. Think about that. Let me repeat that. It's not just about how the content sounds like, or how the content really appears. It's about how it sounds. So just like a well-designed logo or a consistent color scheme helps to visually identify a brand, you can think of a podcast intro, outro, and all the sonic elements in between as its auditory logo that becomes the only contributor to the unique identity of your podcast. What I'm trying to say here is that you are trying to differentiate yourself, right? That should be the goal. That should be the overall or the overarching goal. So you are able to say, okay, how do I differentiate myself? Do I differentiate myself through picture? Do I differentiate myself through audio? Do I differentiate myself through design? Let's say infographics. Whatever it is, you have to go for it, right? The bottom line is you want to really you want to distance yourself from the other podcasts out there. Okay, so one thing I want to say here is that you have to understand that audio has a very powerful impact when it comes to shipping a podcast's unique identity. So crafting an audio brand through music, sound effects, and pacing is actually a strategic move that goes beyond entertainment because you're not just entertaining your audience, you're also connecting with them. You are solidifying your relationship with them. You are establishing a relationship with them. So your audio branding creates a distinct auditory landscape that listeners anticipate and eagerly revisit. That way, you have a quick way to resonate with your audience. So it's one of those things where you have to try a few steps before seeing what works for your particular brain. So if you are trying to build a brain this year for your podcast, you got to really think about podcast landing pages. Not a lot of podcasters think about a podcast landing pages, but they're making a big mistake because you can actually promote your podcast on social media. You can promote your podcast on those podcasting platforms such as Spotify or Apple Podcast. But if you don't have a dedicated landing page to really direct traffic to, you are wasting a lot of resources. So a landing page is a place for all things related to your podcast to go actually to live, okay, to live permanently. So think about a podcast landing page as a hub where listeners can find out how to listen to your show, resources you have mentioned in an episode, where to contact you, and also find supporting content like blogs, infographics, and other material. So this is important. So you want your podcast landing page to be navigable, to be skimmable, to be also reflective of the podcast brand through its color scheme, imagery, and copy. Right? Everything has to be in sync. Really, think about it that way. So apart from strengthening your podcast brand, there are quite a few reasons why I suggest that you have a podcast landing page. Think about SEO. Think about accessibility. Think about listener experience. So when I speak about SEO, basically finding a podcast online without a landing page can be quite difficult, and you want users to be able to listen to your show as easily as possible. So by posting keyword optimized content like blogs, transcripts, and episode details, you increase your podcast reach and visibility on search engines. So that's really important. You also want to think about accessibility. So by providing transcripts of your podcast on your page, you really allow your audiences with different consumption habits or accessibility needs to easily tune into your show. Also, you want to think about listener experience, okay? For your dedicated listeners or new listeners wanting to get a better feel for your show, your podcast landing page is a great place for them to find everything they need. Think about it as a hub, okay? That's the right word, as a hub. Whether it is related blog posts, transcripts, or community forums, you can strengthen the sense of community and generate buzz around your show easily by keeping an up-to-date and on-brand podcast landing page this year. So if you're trying to build a brand for your podcast this year, you got to think about podcast specific marketing strategies. Let me explain a little more. So launching a podcast is not just about hitting record and hoping for the best, right? So you want to have a holistic strategy that not only produces captivating content, but also ensures that the content reaches the right audience. That's how you can create let's say, a resilient machine, a scalable machine, okay? Let me talk to you a little bit about how to really make sure you have podcast marketing strategies helping you push up your experience vis-a-vis your audience. First of all, you want to create separate social channels. So you want to establish dedicated social media profiles solely focused on your podcast. You want to leverage platforms like Twitter, now called X, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, and LinkedIn to share engaging content, behind the scenes snippets, episodes teasers, and also listener interactions. So this ensures your podcast maintains a consistent presence without getting lost within your brain's main channels. You also want to curate newsletters, so craft newsletters centered specifically around your podcast, provide subscribers with exclusive content, episode highlights, guest insights, and additional information that complements every single episode. Because this personalized communication helps nurture a loyal audience by providing them with extra content, but also BTS behind the scenes. Think about guerrilla marketing campaigns. Okay, so get creative with guerrilla marketing tactics. Utilize unconventional strategies like street arts, flash mobs, or innovative stunts that align with your podcast themes to grab attention and actually create buzz. You can also use paid advertising, so you can think about paying for ads on social media, listening apps, or partnerships with influencers to expand your podcast visibility and attract new listeners this year. And finally, you can do cross promotion. So collaborate with other podcasts or brands in related niches, or related niches for cross promotion. So guest appearances, joint campaigns, or mutual shoutouts can introduce your podcast to new audiences and diversify your reach this year. Let me give you a few extras here. So basically, if you want to build a brand this year for your podcast, you need to understand that everything starts with a plan, okay? So basically, you have to understand that you want to engage audiences through social media, because that way you are able to remind audiences and give them a sneak peek of what's to come in your podcast and share key takeaways, okay? You can also think about establishing a strong brand voice, because audiences will recognize your knowledge and appreciate your charisma and talent as a host. You also want to build a unique visual identity. So, if you are able to build a unique visual identity, what happens here is that you will attract people with visually stunning and professional branding. And the thing is that your brand will actually go up in exposure big time. Okay, so call us partial, but basically, a good visual identity makes all the difference. So, having a unique podcast logo and cover art, as well as a visual language that is unique and makes your brand distinguishable, is a great way to make people notice your podcast in the first place, especially if you are trying to get things done faster. Imagine you are a listener scrolling through Apple Podcast or Stitcher, and suddenly you see a bold design that looks completely different from all the vectors and usual stuff. Chances are they will click, listen to a podcast or two, and then if they like it, they will turn to be your fan, right? So your visual identity should, of course, be in line with your content and style. If it is fun, quirky, comical, experimental, translate that into your logo. Is it professional, educational, and needs to be taken seriously? Stick to a more conventional look. Okay. The thing is that unfortunately, all of us, including your listeners, including me, we judge things with our eyes first. So you don't want to lend a wrong impression to your audience. So be very careful in terms of your visual identity there. One thing you want to do also is you what one thing you want to do is to infuse the host personal brand in the marketing strategy, because people will come for them and their unique personalities. Think about Joe Rogan. I mean, the Joe Rogan experience. People really listen to Joe for 3 hours because Joe has a wonderful personality. Okay, so you have to really think about that. So if your podcast has a host who is considered to be an expert in a given industry or has fame of their own, you should piggyback on that status. So there is plenty of startup owners and marketers who have their own podcast in which they share their expertise. Or on the other side of the podcast fame, there are many people who were previously famous as comedians. Think about Joe Rogan. I mean, he still is anyway. You have content creators, or even journalists, but are not famous podcast hosts. Okay, you want to interview important industry players and influencers. That way, you are going to really you're going to go places. I mean, think about Joe Rogan interviewing presidential candidate Donald Trump before the election. That's a biggie for him. That was a biggie for him. You also want to get sponsorship to keep building your brand strategy, because additional funds will help you invest back into your podcast, and you will use it for better visibility and recognition. You also want to learn from branded podcast and marketing podcasts. Okay, what happens here is that you are never going to finish learning. Having a blueprint from a successful podcast will help you focus on the right details. Okay, that's important because it's one of those things where you're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Just use whatever has worked before and try to improve on it. So that's really the strategy you should have this year. So, in conclusion, today's conversation, I explained to you how to build a brain this year. I gave you the generalities, the steps, the extras, and the conclusion. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.